blind veteran in dark sunglasses walked into a maximum security K9 facility looking for a companion. Instead, she stopped dead in front of the isolation cage holding Lewis, a German shepherd so violent he'd been scheduled for euthanasia. Dangerous, broken beyond repair, untouchable. But when the dog caught her scent, something impossible happened. What came next left everyone speechless. Before we dive in, smash that like button and subscribe to the channel. And seriously, I want to know, where in the world are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments below. I love seeing how these stories connect people across continents. The rhythmic click of a white cane against polished linoleum announced her arrival long before anyone saw her face. Karina Valdez, former combat specialist, Purple Heart recipient, and blind for nearly 4 years, navigated the sterile corridor with measured precision. Her right hand swept the cane in controlled arcs. Her left trailed along the cold cinder-block wall, fingers reading the texture like braille. The olive-green utility jacket she wore, faded, worn at the elbows, bearing the ghost of old insignias, hung loose on her frame, a relic from another life. The air told her everything she needed to know. Sharp chemical cleaners couldn't quite mask the underlying musk of animal sweat and anxiety. Metal bowls clanged somewhere in the distance. A chorus of barks, whines, and restless packing created a symphony of canine distress that most visitors found overwhelming. To Karina, it sounded like coming home. She had delayed this visit for months, finding excuses, rescheduling appointments, convincing herself she wasn't ready. She'd survived firefights in territories whose names were still classified. She'd dragged wounded soldiers through hostile terrain while mortar rounds rained down around her. Yet somehow, walking through the front entrance of the Veterans K9 Rehabilitation and Placement Center felt more terrifying than any combat zone. Perhaps because this time, she wasn't fighting an external threat. She was confronting the hollow ache that had carved out a home inside her chest since the day the medics told her the damage to her optic nerves was permanent. Footsteps approached, brisk, businesslike, accompanied by the rustle of a clipboard and the faint squeak of rubber-soled shoes. "Ms. Valdez, you're right on time." The voice belonged to a woman, professional but hurried, like someone perpetually running 5 minutes behind schedule. "I'm Rossi Delgado, facility administrator. We spoke on the phone last week." Karina stopped, angling her head toward the voice, and offered a slight nod. "Just Karina works fine." "Perfect. Well, Karina, we've already pulled the files on 3 excellent candidates for you, all Labradors, all temperament tested, all with previous service training. Very gentle, very reliable. If you'll follow me to the evaluation wing, we can begin the introduction process." Karina's grip on her cane handle tightened almost imperceptibly. "I appreciate the preparation," she said quietly, "but I'd like to walk the facility first, get a feel for the space." There was a pause. Rossi clearly hadn't expected resistance. "Oh, well most of our adoptable animals are centrally located. The outer wings are primarily for intake processing and behavioral cases. There's really nothing back there that would be suitable." "I'd still like to walk through." Another pause, longer this time. Karina could practically hear the internal debate, argue with a decorated veteran or accommodate a request that seemed harmless enough. "Of course," Rossi finally conceded, though her tone had cooled by several degrees. "Right this way." They moved deeper into the building. The barking grew louder, more varied. Karina catalogued each sound, the high, excited yips of younger dogs, the low, frustrated woofs of larger breeds packing in too small spaces, the occasional howl of pure loneliness. Her cane found the edge where polished floor gave way to sealed concrete. The temperature dropped. The air grew heavier, tinged with something sharper than standard kennel smell. "This is the transition corridor," Rossi explained, her voice taking on a rehearsed quality. "We use it for dogs moving between medical and behavioral evaluation. Nothing permanent, just temporary holding." Karina nodded, but she was barely listening. Something had shifted in the atmosphere. The chaotic barking had fallen away, replaced by a sound that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up, a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the concrete itself. Not a warning, not a threat display, something deeper, something broken. She stopped walking. Ms. Valdez, Rossi's voice came from several paces ahead. The evaluation room is just. What's that? Karina asked, turning her head toward the source of the sound. What's what? That dog, the one growling. Rossi's footsteps hurried back. You shouldn't be able to hear that from here. That's the isolation wing, completely separate section. A nervous laugh. You must have incredibly sharp hearing. What dog is it? Nobody you need to concern yourself with. Trust me. Now if we could please continue to. But Karina was already moving, her cane sweeping ahead of her as she followed the sound. Each step brought her closer to that raw, agonized rumble. It wasn't aggression she heard. It was grief. It was rage with nowhere to go. It was the sound she'd heard in her own throat during the months after the field hospital, when the doctors' sympathetic faces told her everything she'd refused to accept. Ms. Valdez, please. Rossi's professional veneer was cracking. That area is restricted. The dog back there isn't. He's not part of the adoption program. What's his name? That's not. What's his name? The question hung in the cold air between them. Finally, Rossi exhaled sharply. Louis, his name is Louis, and he's scheduled for euthanasia in 72 hours because he's too dangerous to be placed anywhere, ever. So please, can we go back to? But Karina wasn't listening anymore. She was already walking toward the isolation wing, toward the sound of a brother in arms she hadn't met yet, toward a fate that neither of them could have predicted. The double doors to the isolation wing bore a hand-painted warning in faded red letters, authorized personnel only. Karina's cane found the threshold, and she stepped across without hesitation. Behind her, Rossi's protests had dissolved into urgent radio chatter, calling for backup, for Stanley the head trainer, for anyone who could talk sense into this stubborn veteran before she got herself killed. The temperature dropped another 5 degrees. The air here carried a different quality, stagnant, heavy with tension that had nowhere to dissipate. Karina's other senses sharpened in the silence. No cheerful barking here, no eager whines of dogs hopping for attention, just her footsteps, her breathing, and that low, continuous growl that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. She moved slowly, respectfully, the way she'd learned to move through villages where every shadow might hide danger. Her cane swept left, right, mapping the corridor, cold metal bars, concrete, a locked gate, empty kennels that smelled of bleach and abandonment. Each cage she passed added another layer to the story this place was trying to tell, a gallery of last chances, final stops, irredeemable cases. Then her cane hit something different. A barrier of yellow caution tape stretched across the corridor at waist height. She ducked under it, fabric brushing against her hair. 3 more steps. The growling intensified, no longer distant, but immediate, visceral. She felt the vibration of it through the floor. Louis, her voice came out softer than she'd intended, almost a whisper. The growling stopped. The sudden silence was more unsettling than the sound had been. Karina stood perfectly still, her cane planted, her free hand resting against her jacket pocket where her fingers found the worn fabric, the old stains that no amount of washing could remove. The scent of jet fuel and cordite had long since faded to human noses, but she knew it was there, woven into the fibers like memory itself. She could hear him now, panting, rapid and shallow, the soft click of claws on metal as he shifted position, the creak of chain link pulled taut. He was massive. She could tell from the displacement of air, the weight of his presence in the small space. And he was watching her with an intensity she could feel like heat on her skin. I'm not here to hurt you, she said, keeping her voice level, conversational. I just wanted to meet you. A sound escaped him then, something between a whine and a growl, confusion made audible. Karina took 1 step closer, then another. Her cane found the bars of his cage. And she wrapped her fingers around the cold metal, feeling the slight vibration of his restless energy conducted through the steel. Someone was running down the corridor behind her, boots pounding on concrete, shouting her name. But Karina didn't turn around. She stood there, inches from the cage everyone feared, and waited to see what the monster would do next. Stanley arrived like a storm, all heavy breathing and urgency. his hand closing around Karina's elbow with surprising gentleness given the panic in his voice. "Ma'am, you need to step back right now. That animal has put 2 handlers in the hospital." Karina didn't move. "Tell me about him." "There's nothing to tell except he's dangerous and you're standing too close." Stanley's grip tightened slightly, trying to guide her away. "Please, I've been training dogs for 23 years and I'm asking you to trust me on this." "Then you've got 23 years of stories," Karina said calmly, "so tell me his." A long silence stretched between them. Behind the bars, Lewis had gone utterly still, his panting the only sound in the concrete tomb. Stanley's hand dropped from her arm, and she heard him scrub his palm across his face, the rasp of calluses against stubble. "He was the best," Stanley said finally, his voice stripped of its earlier urgency, replaced by something heavier. 4 years with the Metro Police, certified in narcotics detection and search and rescue. His handler was a guy named Officer David Brennan. They were perfect together, you know, the kind of team you see maybe once in a career. Lewis could find a gram of cocaine in a shipping container, could locate a missing kid in dense forest in under an hour. He had more successful operations than any dog in the department's history. Karina listened, her hand still on the bars, feeling the micro-tremors that told her Lewis was listening too. "What happened?" she asked. Stanley's breath came out shaky. Routine drug bust went sideways. Suspects opened fire. Brennan took 3 rounds trying to cover his partner's advance. Lewis was 10 feet away when it happened, close enough to... He stopped, composing himself. The dog watched him die, watched the paramedics work on him for 18 minutes before they called it. After that, something broke inside him. Not immediately, took about 3 weeks. Then one day during a training exercise, Lewis just snapped. Went after a decoy trainer like he was trying to kill him. Took 4 people to pull him off. "Grief," Karina said softly. "Maybe, probably, but you can't rehab grief when it comes with 90 pounds of muscle and a bite force that can crack bone." Stanley moved closer, lowering his voice. "We tried everything. Behavioral specialists, medication, isolation protocols, gradual reintroduction. Nothing worked. He's attacked every person who's entered his space since. Doesn't matter if they're bringing food, medical care, nothing. The board voted last week. 72 hours from now, a veterinarian will come with a syringe, and Lewis's war will finally be over." In the cage, Lewis released a sound like shattered glass, part whine, part growl, all anguish. "He understands you," Karina whispered. "He understands plenty," Stanley replied. "Understanding isn't the problem. The problem is he's too broken to save, and standing where you are won't change that." Karina's fingers found the latch mechanism on the cage door, tracing its shape with the careful attention of someone reading a language written in metal and mechanics. Stanley's hand shot out, covering hers before she could explore further. "Don't even think about it," he said, his voice tight with renewed alarm. "There's a reason this cage has 3 separate locks." "I'm not opening anything," Karina replied. "I'm just trying to understand the space." But her other hand was already moving, sliding along the bars until her fingers found the gap where the door met the frame. It was wider than standard issue, maybe 4 inches of clearance, just enough space for food bowls to be slid through without requiring anyone to enter the cage itself. Just enough space for something else. "Ma'am, whatever you're considering, I'm begging you to reconsider." Karina unbuttoned her jacket cuff and began rolling up her sleeve. The scars on her forearm caught the fluorescent light, burned tissue, shrapnel marks, the roadmap of a body that had survived things it wasn't supposed to survive. She flexed her fingers, feeling the slight stiffness in her wrist where the bones had been pinned back together. "I've lost a lot," she said quietly, "but I'm not afraid of losing more." Before Stanley could stop her, she slid her bare hand through the gap in the cage door, palm up, fingers relaxed. The gesture was an offering, a question, a dare. She felt the shift in air pressure as Lewis moved toward her, heard the click of claws on metal grating, sensed the massive shape of him coiling like a spring about to release. Stanley made a strangled sound. "Jesus Christ, pull your hand back, pull it back right now." But Karina held perfectly still. Lewis's breathing had changed, coming in rapid, uncertain bursts. She could feel the heat of him now, could smell the complicated scent of an animal kept too long in confinement. Sweat, fear, rage, desperation all mingled together. Her fingers trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the effort of remaining motionless when every instinct screamed at her to retreat. The snarl started low in Lewis's chest, building like thunder, a sound designed by evolution to trigger flight responses in prey animals. It filled the small space, bouncing off concrete walls, becoming its own physical force. Karina's jaw clenched, but her hand stayed extended, offered, waiting. Then something shifted. The snarl fractured, breaking apart into something else entirely. A whine, high and confused, escaped Lewis's throat. Karina felt the sudden rush of air as he moved closer, felt the wet heat of his breath against her palm, felt the tentative touch of his nose against her fingertips, cold, damp, searching. He inhaled deeply, pulling her scent into his lungs, processing information written in molecules too small for human perception. His entire body went rigid. Another whine, this one almost painful in its confusion. Then another deep breath, longer this time, as if he was trying to solve an impossible equation. Stanley whispered behind her, "I don't believe what I'm seeing." Stanley circled around to get a better angle, his boots scraping softly against the concrete as he tried to make sense of what he was witnessing. Lewis had gone completely still, his nose pressed against Karina's palm, drawing in breath after breath with an intensity that bordered on desperate. The growling had stopped entirely, replaced by a series of soft, questioning sounds that Stanley had never heard from this dog in all the months since the incident. "What the hell is happening?" Stanley breathed, more to himself than to Karina. Karina kept her hands steady, letting Lewis investigate, letting him pull whatever information he needed from her skin. She could feel the wet velvet of his nose, the slight tickle of whiskers, the warmth of each exhale against her wrist. Then Lewis shifted, pressing his muzzle harder against her hand, angling upward toward the fabric of her jacket sleeve. "It's the jacket," Karina said suddenly, her voice filled with a dawning realization. "He's reacting to my jacket." "What about it?" Stanley moved closer, peering at the faded olive-green utility jacket that hung on Karina's frame like a second skin. It looked like standard military issue, worn and weathered, the kind of garment that had seen too many deployments to ever look new again. "I wore this overseas," Karina explained, her free hand moving to touch the fabric at her shoulder. "Iraq, Afghanistan, classified operations in between. It's been washed 100 times, but," she trailed off, understanding blooming. What was Lewis trained to detect? Stanley's eyes widened. Narcotics primarily, but his specialty was compound detection. Explosives, accelerants, chemical signatures. He was trained on military-grade materials, C4, cordite, various fuel compounds. His voice picked up speed as the pieces fell into place. Brennan came from a military family. Half the guys in their unit were former service members. Lewis was exposed to those scents constantly during training and operations. "JP-8 jet fuel," Karina said softly. "We used it for everything. Generators, heaters, vehicles. You work around it long enough, it gets into your clothes, your gear, your skin, and cordite from weapons discharge, weapon cleaning, live-fire drills." She flexed her fingers slightly, and Lewis followed the movement with laser focus. "This jacket was my work uniform. I wore it during some of the worst missions of my deployment. The smells are probably embedded in the fiber at a molecular level." Lewis made a sound then that neither of them had expected, a soft, almost puppy-like whimper. His entire posture had changed. The coiled aggression had unwound, replaced by something that looked almost like recognition, like confusion, like hope. He pressed his face harder against Karina's sleeve, inhaling deeply, his tail giving one tentative, uncertain wag. "He thinks you're military," Stanley whispered, awe creeping into his voice. "He thinks you're one of Brennan's people. He thinks," Stanley's voice cracked slightly, "he thinks you're home." Rossi's arrival shattered the fragile moment like a hammer through glass. Her footsteps came rapid and sharp, accompanied by the rustle of paperwork clutched in white-knuckled hands and the barely controlled fury of an administrator whose carefully maintained protocols had been completely disregarded. "What in God's name is going on here?" Her voice ricocheted off the concrete walls, making Lewis flinch and pull away from Karina's hand. "Stanley, I called you down here to remove her, not to stand there having a chat while she violates every safety regulation we have." Karina slowly withdrew her hand from the cage, lowering it to her side. Lewis tracked the movement, releasing a low whine of protest. Stanley turned to face Rossi, positioning himself partially between the administrator and Karina. "Rossi, you need to see this. Something's happening here that I can't explain, but—" "I don't need to see anything except Ms. Valdez leaving this wing immediately." Rossi's heels clicked closer, and Karina could smell her perfume cutting through the kennel odors, something floral and expensive and entirely out of place in this concrete tomb. "Do you have any idea what would happen to this facility if she'd been injured? We'd be shut down. Lawsuits, investigations, the whole 9 yards." "She wasn't in danger," Stanley protested. Lewis was calm, more than calm he was. "I don't care if he was reciting Shakespeare," Rossi cut him off. "That animal has a documented history of violent behavior. He's scheduled for humane euthanasia, and that decision is final. It was approved by the board, by our behavioral specialists, and by the County Veterinary Oversight Committee." She shifted her attention to Karina. "Ms. Valdez, I understand you're a veteran and I respect your service, but this facility has liability concerns that supersede individual requests. You have no authorization to be in this wing." Karina turned to face the voice, her dark sunglasses reflecting the harsh fluorescent lights. "I'm not asking to take him home today. I'm asking for an evaluation period. Let me work with him, supervised if necessary. Give him a chance before." "Absolutely not." Rossi's response came so quickly it overlapped with Karina's words. "This dog is beyond rehabilitation. We've invested months of professional resources into that determination. I cannot, will not, expose this facility to the legal and ethical nightmare of allowing an untrained civilian to interact with a dog who has already hospitalized 2 trained professionals." "He recognized her," Stanley interjected. "The scent on her jacket, it triggered something, a memory, maybe a—" "Enough," Rossi's voice dropped to something colder than anger, something administrative and final. "Stanley, escort Ms. Valdez to the main lobby. Ms. Valdez, you are hereby banned from the isolation wing. If you attempt to access this area again, I will have you removed from the premises entirely and pursue a restraining order if necessary. Am I making myself clear?" The silence that followed was answer enough. 3 days crawled past like wounded animals. Karina spent them in her apartment, packing the space she knew by heart, counting down the hours until Lewis's scheduled euthanasia. She'd filed an emergency appeal with the County Animal Welfare Board, only to be told that overturning a facility decision required a minimum of 14 days for review. Lewis had 72 hours. The math didn't work, and no amount of arguing with bureaucrats changed it. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, she couldn't take the waiting anymore. She called a rideshare, gave the driver the address, and made the trip back to the facility with no plan except to be there, to bear witness, to make sure Lewis didn't die alone and forgotten in that concrete cell. The driver dropped her at the entrance just after 2 o'clock. The February air carried the sharp bite of late winter, and Karina pulled her olive jacket tighter as she navigated the walkway to the front doors. Inside, the usual cacophony of barking seemed muted, anxious. Something felt off in a way she couldn't articulate, a tension in the atmosphere like the moment before a storm breaks. She'd barely made it 10 feet into the lobby when the first alarm started screaming. The sound was piercing, mechanical, designed to cut through every other noise and demand immediate attention. Emergency lighting kicked on, bathing everything in pulsing red that Karina couldn't see but could feel in the sudden shift of warmth against her face. Voices erupted around her, staff members shouting coordinates, directions, protocols. "Fire in the east mechanical room," someone yelled, spreading to the adjacent storage area. "Get the animals out, start with the main kennels." Footsteps thundered in every direction. Karina pressed herself against the wall, trying to stay out of the way as handlers rushed past, their arms full of leashes, carriers, panicked dogs. The smell hit her then, smoke, acrid and chemical, carrying undertones of burning plastic and electrical insulation. A wiring fire, old infrastructure finally giving out. Stanley's voice cut through the chaos, barking orders with military precision. Section A clear. Moving to Section B, someone get the transport van around to the loading dock. Karina's hand tightened on her cane. The isolation wing was in the east quadrant. The mechanical room backed up to it. She started moving, navigating by memory and sound, following the flow of fleeing staff members in reverse. "Ma'am, you need to evacuate." A young handler grabbed her shoulder, trying to steer her toward the exit. Karina shook him off. "The isolation wing. Is anyone getting the dogs from isolation?" "There's only one dog back there, and he's—" The handler stopped, understanding dawning in his voice. "He's unapproachable. We can't extract him without sedation, and there's no time." "Where's Stanley?" "Evacuating the medical ward." "Ma'am, please, you have to leave now." But Karina was already running toward the smoke. The double doors to the isolation wing had been propped open, probably by fleeing staff, and smoke poured through the gap like a living thing. Karina heard handlers coughing, retreating, their vision useless in the thick grey fog that filled the corridor. Someone grabbed at her as she pushed forward. "You can't go in there. You can't see anything." "Neither can you," Karina shot back and kept moving. The smoke didn't change her world the way it changed theirs. She'd been navigating darkness for 4 years, had learned to build mental maps from sound and touch and memory. The sighted handlers were suddenly blind, panicking, disoriented. But Karina dropped into the familiar rhythms of her disability like slipping into well-worn boots. She pulled her jacket collar up over her nose and mouth, filtering the worst of the smoke, and extended her cane. The tapping sound changed quality in the haze, echoing differently, but the corridor layout remained exactly as she'd memorized it 3 days ago. 12 paces to the first kennels, 28 to the yellow caution tape, 35 to Lewis's cage. Heat pressed against her face, intensifying as she moved deeper into the wing. The fire was close, maybe just beyond the eastern wall, eating through old insulation and dried wood framing. She could hear it crackling, hungry, spreading. Somewhere behind her, Stanley was shouting her name, his voice desperate and distant. She counted her steps, 26, 27, her lungs burned, each breath pulling in smoke despite the fabric barrier, 28. Her cane caught the caution tape, and she ducked under it without breaking stride. The heat was brutal now, radiating from the walls, turning the corridor into an oven. Then she heard him. Through the roar of flames and the screaming alarms, she heard Lewis, not barking, not growling, whining, high-pitched, terrified, the sound of an animal who understood exactly what was happening and knew he was trapped. The sound was coming from her right, slightly elevated, the cage. "Lewis," she called his name, her voice hoarse from smoke. "I'm here, I'm coming." The whining intensified, frantic now. She heard him throwing himself against the cage door, metal rattling, chain link straining, 32 steps, 33. Her cane hit the bars, and she dropped to her knees, hands reaching up to find the lock mechanisms. The metal was already hot to the touch, heat from the nearby fire conducting through the steel frame. Her fingers found the first latch, a simple slide bolt, probably installed as backup security. She threw it. The second lock was a padlock, and her heart sank until her searching fingers found it hanging open, someone's oversight in the chaos. The third lock was the main mechanism, a keyed deadbolt designed to keep dangerous animals contained. Karina's fingers traced its shape, found the keyhole, understood immediately that she had no way to open it. Behind the wall, something exploded with a shower of sparks she couldn't see, but could feel as a wave of searing heat. Karina's hands worked frantically over the lock mechanism, searching for any weakness, any give in the metal. Her fingers were already blistering from the heat, but she barely registered the pain. Behind the bars, Lewis had gone silent, except for his ragged breathing, as if he understood that she was his only chance and didn't want to distract her. Then her searching fingers found something unexpected. The bolt housing was mounted to the door frame with screws, old ones, corroded by years of humidity and chemical cleaners. She pulled off her jacket despite the heat, wrapped it around her hand for protection, and gripped the entire lock assembly. She threw her weight backward once, twice, feeling the screws strain. The third pull tore the housing free from the frame with a shriek of metal. The deadbolt, still locked, came away completely, leaving the door secured by nothing. Karina grabbed the cage door and hauled it open. For one crystallized moment, nothing happened. She knelt there in the smoke, her ruined hands still gripping the bars, waiting to see if she'd just freed a traumatized animal who would tear her apart in his panic to escape. Every handler's warning, every protocol violation, every reason this was insane flooded through her mind. Then she felt him, not attacking, not fleeing. Louis pressed his massive body against her side, solid and warm and trembling. His nose found her hand, her wrist, her face, checking her with urgent efficiency. A soft whine escaped him, and then he was moving, positioning himself at her left side in a posture she recognized from guide dog training, shoulder level with her hip, body angled to provide direction. "Get us out," Karina whispered, her smoke-ravaged voice barely audible. "Please." Louis moved forward, and Karina moved with him, her hand dropping to rest against his shoulder. She'd trained with guide dogs before, knew the basics, but this was different. Louis wasn't following memorized routes or obeying commands. He was navigating pure chaos, making split-second decisions based on sounds and smells that changed with every breath. He pulled her left, away from a section of ceiling that collapsed 3 seconds later, raining sparks and burning insulation where they'd been standing. He stopped abruptly, and Karina felt the wave of heat that indicated they'd almost walked into the fire itself. Louis backed up, turned them around, found another path. A support beam gave way somewhere ahead, the crash enormous, blocking what must have been their route. Karina felt Louis's muscles bunch beneath her hand, felt him calculating, processing. Then he was pulling her down, and she understood he wanted her to crawl. The smoke would be thinner near the floor, the heat less intense. She dropped to her knees, and Louis stayed with her, his body a compass point in the hellscape, getting her around obstacles she couldn't see, through gaps she would never have found alone. They emerged from the smoke like ghosts, materializing at the facility's side exit where emergency crews had set up a staging area. Karina collapsed onto the cold pavement, her lungs heaving, each breath a knife of pain. Louis stayed pressed against her, refusing to leave her side even when paramedics approached with oxygen masks and medical supplies. Stanley appeared through the chaos, his face streaked with soot, his eyes wide with disbelief. He dropped to his knees beside them, one hand reaching tentatively toward Louis, half expecting the aggression to return now that the immediate danger had passed. But Louis simply looked at him, panting hard, his dark eyes clear and focused in a way Stanley hadn't seen since before Brennan's death. "You insane, beautiful lunatic," Stanley breathed, though it was unclear whether he was talking to Karina or the dog. The paramedics worked on Karina, treating her burns, checking her vitals, insisting she needed to go to the hospital for smoke inhalation. She waved them off with bandaged hands, her attention fixed on the massive shape beside her. Louis had settled into a sphinx position, his body forming a barrier between Karina and the rest of the world, as if he'd assigned himself a new mission and wouldn't be distracted from it. Rossi arrived 20 minutes later, emerging from her car with a phone pressed to her ear, coordinating insurance claims and damage assessments. She stopped short when she saw the tableau, Karina sitting on the ambulance bumper with oxygen tubing in her nose, Louis's head resting on her lap. Stanley crouched beside them with a veterinary first aid kit, checking the dog for injuries. The administrator opened her mouth, then closed it again. Whatever speech she'd prepared died unspoken. "He saved my life," Karina said quietly, her smoke-roughened voice carrying across the distance. "I went in for him, but he's the one who got us out. He guided me through fire and collapsing infrastructure like he'd been training for it his whole life." Stanley looked up at Rossi, his expression unreadable. The behavioral assessment was based on a dog in crisis, grieving, isolated. What we just witnessed was a working dog who found his purpose again. "I'm recommending immediate reinstatement to active status and placement with Ms. Valdez pending standard evaluations." "That's not," Rossi started, but her voice lacked its earlier conviction. She looked at Louis, really looked at him, seeing something different than the monster in the isolation wing. The dog was calm, attentive, his body language completely transformed. "The board will need to review." The board approved his euthanasia for today, Stanley interrupted. Technically, he's already passed his expiration date, which means unless you want to fight a decorated veteran who just risked her life to save facility property, Lewis is already hers by default. A long silence settled over the parking lot, broken only by the distant sound of fire crews extinguishing the last of the flames. Karina's bandaged hand moved slowly through Lewis's fur, and the dog leaned into her touch with something that looked like contentment, like relief, like coming home after a long deployment. Rossi sighed, the sound of someone recognizing when they'd lost a battle they shouldn't have been fighting in the first place. I'll need documentation, veterinary clearance, behavioral reassessment, standard adoption paperwork. She paused, her voice softening almost imperceptibly. And for what it's worth, Ms. Valdez, that was either the bravest or most reckless thing I've ever witnessed. I haven't decided which. Both, Karina said, a faint smile crossing her soot-stained face. Definitely both. Stanley produced a clipboard from somewhere, already filled with preliminary forms. I can fast-track the evaluations. Given the circumstances, I think we can safely say Lewis has demonstrated exceptional stability under extreme stress. His handler assessment scores are going to be off the charts. His handler, Rossi raised an eyebrow. That's what she is now, Stanley said simply, nodding toward Karina, whether she knows it or not. Karina felt Lewis shift against her leg, his weight solid and reassuring, his breathing steady and calm. She thought about the emptiness that had followed her home from war, the sense of being useless, disconnected, without purpose. She'd come looking for a guide dog, something to help her navigate a world she could no longer see. Instead, she'd found a soldier who understood that navigation was more than avoiding obstacles. Sometimes it meant running toward the fire. Sometimes it meant trusting someone else to lead you through the smoke. Sometimes it meant recognizing that being broken wasn't the same as being finished. "When can we go home?" she asked. Stanley glanced at Rossi, who gave a small, reluctant nod. "Soon as the vet clears him and we get your signature on about 15 different forms," Stanley said. "Welcome to dog ownership, Karina. It's mostly paperwork and picking up poop, with occasional moments of terrifying heroism." Lewis made a sound that might have been agreement, his tail giving a single, decisive thump against the pavement. Karina smiled, her hand finding the familiar worn fabric of her olive jacket that someone had draped over her shoulders. The scent of jet fuel and cordite had been joined by new smells, now smoke, ash, salvation. She wondered if Lewis could smell those too, if he understood that they'd both been forged in fire and come out the other side as something new. "Let's get started on that paperwork," she said. And somewhere in the distance, as the February sun began its descent toward the horizon, the last of the facility's alarms finally fell silent.